The village of Meadowbrook lay tucked beneath a quilt of low-hanging clouds, their bellies swollen with the promise of rain. In a weathered farmhouse on the edge of town, Sarah Conway stood at the kitchen sink, her eyes fixed on the small figure playing in the backyard garden. Her son, 5-year-old Tommy, knelt in the dirt, drawing quiet spirals in the soil with his fingers. He hadn't spoken a word in nearly a year. Not since the fire. Not since the night the house next door went up in flames and her husband walked out without a goodbye. The doctors called it selective mutism triggered by trauma. Sarah simply called it heartbreak. "Tommy, stay where I can see you," she called gently through the open window. Tommy glanced up at her, his solemn brown eyes meeting hers for a single moment. He gave a quiet nod, then returned to his silent play. The air was charged with something invisible and electricity Sarah couldn't quite name. She dried her hands on a towel and glanced at the sky, dark and pressing. The storm was close. Then, thunder cracked like a whip. She flinched, nearly dropping a plate. When she looked back outside, the garden was empty. "Tommy," she cried, rushing toward the back door, panic blooming in her chest. "Tommy." No reply. The yard was still. The bundle of twigs Tommy had been arranging lay scattered like forgotten offerings. Sarah's eyes swept frantically to the tree lane that bordered their property. Beyond the lawn, the forest loomed dark, thick, and old. Tommy was terrified of the woods. He never went near them. Not alone. But something had changed. Sarah tore across the grass barefoot, her feet slick against the wet blades. "Tommy." Her voice echoed back to her, swallowed by the trees. She didn't hesitate. She ran straight into the forest. The canopy swallowed her whole. The light dimmed. The earthy scent of moss and decay curled around her like breath. Branches scratched at her arms and tangled her hair. "Tommy," she called again, voice ragged. "Please." Then footprints. Small ones. Just a head pressed into the mud-soft trail. Sarah followed them, each step heavier with fear. The path led downward, into a part of the woods no one liked to talk about. An old clearing with an abandoned well. Just a circle of stone now sunken and moss-covered, a mouth to nowhere. The rain began to fall in earnest, cold and hard. She broke through the last curtain of trees just as lightning lit up the clearing in a sudden, blinding white and froze. Tommy lay flat on his stomach at the edge of the well, arms stretched down into the void. "Tommy," she screamed. But he didn't turn. His small body was still, eyes fixed downward. As Sarah dropped beside him in the mud, she heard it too soft, broken sounds rising from the well. Whimpers, cries, not human. Sarah leaned over the lip of the well and gasped. 2 German shepherds stared back up at her. One lay on her side, barely breathing. The other stood guard, her lips curled in a silent warning. Both were pregnant. Their bellies were swollen and strained, their fur matted, their ribs visible beneath. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered. Tommy grabbed her sleeve, pulling her attention. His eyes burned not with fear, but with urgency. He pointed into the well, then mimed pulling something up. His message was clear. "We have to save them." Sarah's throat tightened. "Tommy, we can't, they're too heavy. We need to call someone." But her phone was back in the kitchen, and the storm was already turning the clearing into a swamp. Tommy didn't waver. He shook his head and pointed again, more forcefully now. Then he mimicked pushing his hands against his own belly. Realization hit her like another bolt of lightning. One of the dogs was in labor. Sarah looked at her son, her silent, broken boy who hadn't uttered a word in a year, and for the first time in 12 months, she didn't see silence. She saw will, purpose. Something had awakened in him. And in that moment, she understood with a terrible clarity. Today would not be ordinary. And her son was about to speak again through courage, not words. The storm exploded over the clearing as if nature itself was bearing witness to what was about to unfold. Thunder rolled through the trees. Rain slammed the earth in waves. But neither Sarah nor Tommy moved from the edge of the well. Sarah's mind raced. The dogs were 10 feet down, soaked, trembling, and trapped. The sides of the well were slick with moss and rainwater. No steps, no rungs, no way up. She looked around frantically, trying to find anything that could help. But it was Tommy who moved first. Without a word, he darted into the trees, his small form disappearing into the green haze. "Tommy." Sarah called after him, but the boy didn't answer. Her heart clenched with panic until he returned moments later, dragging long vines soaked and tangled, his small arms trembling from the effort. He dropped them in a heap beside her and immediately went back for more. Sarah stared at him, breathless not just from fear but awe. Her silent son was moving with clarity, with purpose. His small fingers tore at the vines, unwinding them, testing their strength. He wasn't panicking. He was building. And somehow, she understood. They were going to make a rope. "Good thinking, sweetheart," she said softly, her voice shaking. Together, mother and son twisted the vines into thick cords, knotting them into a crude but strong length. The rain made it hard, slippery, cold, but they didn't stop. The dogs below whimpered louder now, especially the one lying on her side, her contractions beginning. Time was running out. "We need a sling," Sarah muttered, scanning the clearing. "Something strong enough to hold them." Tommy was already ahead of her. He peeled off his tiny jacket and held it out. Sarah frowned. "It's too small," she said gently. But Tommy shook his head and pointed first to the jacket, then to the rope, then mimicked a cradle in his arms. Understanding clicked. "Reinforce the middle," she whispered. "Make the cradle stronger." They worked quickly, threading the vines through the jacket sleeves, tightening the knots with Rain's slick fingers. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't safe. But it was all they had. Sarah tied one end of the makeshift rope to a sturdy oak near the well. The other end dangled like a lifeline into the darkness. "I don't know if they'll understand," she said aloud. "They're scared. They might not trust us." But Tommy was already lowering himself toward the well, just far enough to see them. Sarah grabbed his legs, holding him steady, as he began making gentle clicking noises with his tongue. The standing dog bared her teeth, a low growl vibrating up the well's stone walls. "Careful," Sarah whispered. But Tommy didn't stop. He extended his hand, palm open, fingers still. The growl faded. The dog tilted her head, sniffed the air. Then, slowly, she stepped forward and nudged the dog in labor. What happened next stole Sarah's breath. The pregnant dog, shaking violently, pushed herself upright. With the other dog's help, she hobbled into the cradle of the makeshift sling. She didn't whimper. She didn't resist. She just looked up at Tommy. Like she understood. "Now?" Sarah asked. Tommy nodded. "Fun." Sarah took hold of the rope. 1, 2, 3. They pulled. The weight of the dog was tremendous. The rope groaned. The cradle swayed. But inch by inch, the dog rose toward the surface. Sarah's muscles screamed with every tug. Tommy braced his body and pulled with all his might. The dog's head emerged over the edge, eyes wide, body trembling. One more pull. Together they hauled her out. She collapsed onto the grass, panting but alive. Her swollen belly heaved with shallow breaths, her paws caked in mud. Tommy turned instantly back to the well, pointing frantically. The second dog. Sarah nodded and lowered the rope again. This time, without hesitation, the second dog stepped into the cradle. They pulled. Harder this time. The rain had made the rope even more slippery. Sarah's palms burned. Her shoulders ached. Tommy grunted with effort, his face red, his eyes focused only on the rope. The dog rose, slowly, steadily. Then snap. A sickening crack echoed through the clearing. One of the vines had broken. The dog fell, flailing in the sling, paws scraping against the stone. Sarah lunged forward, grabbed for her caught fur in her fingers, but lost her grip. At that same moment, Tommy slipped forward, teetering toward the edge. Without thinking, Sarah let go of the dog and caught her son's ankle. The dog fell back into the well. A sharp yelp rose from the darkness. Tommy twisted in Sarah's arms, staring down with horror. "No," he whispered. Then, from the bottom of his chest, from the broken place that hadn't made a sound in a year, he screamed. "Mama, help her." Sarah froze. That voice. That word. Tommy was speaking. After a year of silence, the dam had broken, and with it, her fear, her paralysis, her doubt. She clutched her son to her chest, sobbing into his wet hair. And then, softly, she said, "We will, baby. I promise you. We will save her." The clearing had turned to a swamp, rain soaking every inch of Sarah's clothes, matting Tommy's hair to his forehead, and turning the earth beneath their knees to mud. But none of it mattered. Something had shifted not just in the air, but in them. Tommy was speaking again. His voice had cracked the silence of a year, and Sarah couldn't afford to let that moment slip into despair. "We need more vines," she whispered urgently. Tommy didn't hesitate. He scrambled back toward the tree line, fingers clawing at bark and branches, dragging fresh coils of vines through the mud. Sarah joined him, her hands trembling with cold and adrenaline as she picked up the rope remnants and examined the broken ends. The first dog, the one they had pulled out, stood unsteadily nearby. Her fur hung heavy with rain. She took a few limping steps toward the well and let out a low, haunting whine as she peered down into the darkness. It wasn't just fear. It was grief and a quiet, desperate hope. "We'll get her back," Sarah promised aloud, unsure whether she was talking to the dog, her son, or herself. They worked quickly, splicing new vines into the rope, strengthening it at the weak points. Tommy's small hands moved with surprising skill, twisting and tying knots as if he'd done it 100 times. Sarah marveled at him, this boy who hadn't spoken a word since the night of the fire, who now moved like someone reborn with purpose. Their first makeshift sling had been made with Tommy's jacket. This time, Tommy dragged over a weathered tarp he'd found caught on a bush, an old sheet of waterproof canvas, likely left behind by a hunter years ago. "This will hold," Sarah said, inspecting the thick material. "If we reinforce it." Tommy already knew. He was threading the tarp into the new rope, creating a cradle deeper and sturdier than before. His face was flushed with effort, but his eyes were clear, sharp with focus. The transformation in him wasn't just physical. Something had awakened inside. Something Sarah hadn't seen in him since he was a baby. By the time the new sling was ready, the rain had softened to a heavy drizzle. The well gaped like an open wound, black and waiting. Sarah braced herself as she tied the rope once more to the oak. This time she double-looped it, testing her full weight against the knot. Tommy crawled to the edge, making his now familiar soft clicking sounds. Below, the second dog answered. A faint whimper, then silence. "She's still alive," Sarah whispered. The dog above the well, her sister, perhaps crawled forward until her front paws touched the rim. Her body trembled as she peered down, issuing another whine. Tommy reached out and touched her gently, and she leaned into him, calm settling over her body like a blanket. Then Sarah began to lower the rope. The cradle sank slowly, spinning slightly in the shaft, until it touched the bottom. They waited. Nothing. "She doesn't understand," Sarah muttered. "She's hurt and scared." But Tommy leaned closer to the well and whispered, "It's okay. You can trust us." Sarah blinked. His voice had changed. Steady. Sure. He spoke not to comfort, but to command with the gentleness of someone who knew he'd be heard. And somehow, he was. The second dog emerged from the shadows, limping forward. Her belly was even more swollen now, her steps unsteady. She sniffed the rope cradle, looked up, and stepped in. "Now," Tommy cried. They pulled. Sarah's muscles screamed. The rope cut into her palms, but she gritted her teeth and kept going. The dog was heavier than the first. Or maybe Sarah was just weaker now, exhausted, soaked, freezing. But she didn't stop. Tommy pulled beside her, his small body leaning with everything he had. Inch by inch, the dog rose. Halfway up the well, a gust of wind whipped through the clearing. Sarah staggered. Tommy slipped in the mud. The rope tilted. Then the dog slipped. A sharp yelp cut through the air as her body twisted in the sling, one paw dangling barely inside. Sarah cried out, grabbing the rope tighter. Her arms burned. Her chest heaved. "Hold on," she gasped. Tommy lunged forward, arms around the rope, gritting his teeth. "She's slipping," Sarah screamed. Then, from the edge of the well, the first dog stepped forward and let out a bark, not angry, not afraid. It was sharp, urgent, a command. And the dog below responded. She curled her paw back into the sling, just as Sarah gave one final heave. Her head broke the surface. Her paws gripped the stone edge. Sarah reached down, grabbed her scruff, and pulled. Tommy braced her ankles. Sarah grunted with effort. Then the dog was out safe, soaked, trembling but breathing. She collapsed next to her sister, both of them now curled on the wet grass. Sarah dropped to her knees beside them, unable to hold back tears. "We did it," she whispered, her voice raw. Tommy sat beside her. "She's going to have her puppies soon," he said quietly. Sarah looked at him, at her son, at the two dogs whose lives they had just saved. She didn't know how this had all begun, but now she knew one thing for certain. It was far from over. The storm had quieted, but its weight still lingered in the clearing like a breath being held. Thunder rolled far off in the distance, as if reluctantly releasing the land from its grip. Rain had faded into a misty drizzle, leaving everything drenched and glistening beneath a silver-gray sky. Sarah knelt beside the two dogs, her knees buried in mud. Both animals lay side by side, their swollen bellies heaving, their eyes glazed from exhaustion. But they were alive. Somehow, against the odds, they were alive. Tommy sat cross-legged a few feet away, whispering something to the dog they had rescued, second the one who had nearly slipped into the abyss forever. She blinked at him, slowly, with a gaze that felt intelligent. Too intelligent. Sarah reached toward the first dog, intending to check her legs for wounds, and her fingers brushed something cold beneath her fur, a metal tag. She paused, slid her hand along the dog's neck, grasped the collar and turned the tag over. What she saw sent a cold shiver down her spine. It wasn't a typical ID tag. No name. No address. No cutesy engraving. Just a number and alphanumeric sequence etched in uniform block letters. And below that, a tiny symbol, a stylized laboratory flask. Sarah blinked hard. She looked to the second dog, now curled tighter around her belly, her breath growing faster, the labor clearly progressing. Gently, Sarah checked her collar as well. An identical tag. But the last letter in the code was different, E on one, F on the other. "What is this?" Sarah whispered. "Mama," Tommy said suddenly. She turned to him. His face was pale but steady. "They're not normal dogs," he said softly. "They were in a bad place." Sarah's heart skipped. "What do you mean?" "How do you know that?" Tommy didn't answer. Instead, he laid his hand on the first dog's head. The animal leaned into his touch like a child nuzzling into a parent's shoulder. Sarah stared. There was something too human in the gesture, too trusting. "Tommy," she said cautiously, "are you hearing things? From them?" He nodded, slowly. Not words, just knowing. Sarah looked away, toward the tree lane, trying to steady her breath. She didn't want to panic, but the unease in her chest was growing heavier by the second. A sharp cry broke through the moment. The second dog, the one they'd just pulled from the well, let out a whimpering groan and shifted suddenly, her body stiffening with another contraction. Sarah dropped to her side, gently stroking her head. "It's starting," she said aloud. "She's going into labor." The first dog moved closer, nuzzling her companion's ear and lying down beside her, as if bracing her for what was to come. Sarah grabbed the tarp they had used for the sling and spread it across a patch of dry grass nearby, layering it with whatever blankets and fabric she could salvage from her backpack. "We need to move her here," Sarah said. Tommy stepped forward without a word. He placed a hand on the laboring dog's back and whispered something inaudible. The dog lifted her head, and to Sarah's amazement, she began to crawl toward the tarp slowly, painfully, but deliberately. Tommy and Sarah guided her the rest of the way. The wind picked up again as if the world were holding its breath for what came next. Sarah knelt beside the dog, brushing damp fur from her eyes. "You're okay, girl," she whispered. "We've got you now." Tommy crouched nearby, his eyes wide, his hands resting gently on the edge of the tarp. The first dog, her sister, or something even closer, lay beside them both, unmoving, except for the occasional twitch of her ears and a low, comforting whine. Then, as another contraction hit, the second dog let out a yelp. Her body tensed. Sarah felt the pressure of urgency flood her chest. She had helped deliver calves on her grandparents' farm long ago, but this was different. this was closer. This was someone who had looked at her with awareness. Another push. A small shape appeared. "Tommy," Sarah said quietly. "The first puppy's coming." A dark sack slipped into view. Sarah leaned forward to help, but the mother didn't need her. She instinctively turned, bit open the sack, and began licking the tiny creature clean. A faint squeak emerged. Tommy smiled. "It's breathing." Sarah exhaled, realizing she had been holding her breath. The puppy, small, damp, but alive, wiggled toward its mother's belly. The second dog let out a long, tired sigh and curled her body protectively around her baby. And then another contraction. A second puppy, then a third. Sarah and Tommy watched in awe as life emerged from the storm's ruin. Each new pup was like a piece of healing stitched back into the fabric of their lives. 4 puppies now nestled at their mother's side. But then Tommy whispered something that sent a chill back into Sarah's blood. "They're not just puppies, Mama." She turned. "What do you mean?" Tommy didn't look away from the last puppy, smaller than the others, with a strange, pale fur patch in the center of its chest. As it rolled, Sarah saw it clearly, a white marking in the shape of a star. "That one," Tommy whispered. "He's different." Sarah leaned in, staring at the star-shaped birthmark. And suddenly, the meaning of the tags, the silence, the escape from the well, all felt like puzzle pieces rearranging in her mind. This wasn't just a rescue. It was the beginning of something much larger. The pups had arrived like tiny miracles, blinking into life against the cold, muddy cradle of the forest. 4 of them nestled quietly beneath their mother's belly, warm against the chill. But it was the smallest one, the one with the star-shaped mark, that Sarah couldn't take her eyes off of. The silence that had once felt so heavy now felt holy. Even the forest seemed to still around them, as if listening. Sarah sat beside the dogs, her hands covered in wet leaves and the smell of earth, while Tommy dozed with his back against the tree. He hadn't said a word since his last whisper, but he didn't need to. The way he breathed now, slow, even told her he was finally at peace. But peace, she would soon learn, was not meant to last. A snapping sound. Not loud, not close, but clear, too precise to be an animal. Sarah's head snapped up. She scanned the trees, heart pounding. Her fingers instinctively found Tommy's shoulder. He stirred but didn't open his eyes. Another crack, closer this time. Not thunder, not wind. A deliberate sound. Human. Sarah rose slowly, peering through the tree line. The clearing's edges had darkened with dusk, but her eyes had adjusted. At first, she saw nothing. And then movement. A figure. Standing half-shrouded in mist, tall, wearing a long coat, still as a post beneath the dripping pines. Sarah froze. Her hand closed around the branch nearest her, lifting it like a club. "Who's there?" she called, her voice hoarse. No response. The figure didn't move. Behind her, the 2 dogs stirred, low growls vibrating deep in their throats. The mother with the puppies pulled them close with her paw. The other, still weak, forced herself up, teeth bared. Tommy opened his eyes. "Mama," he whispered. "He's not here to help." "How do you know?" she whispered back. Tommy stared forward, his small face pale. "Because she's afraid of him." He pointed to the standing dog, now growling louder, pushing herself between Sarah and the trees. The figure stepped forward. 1 step. Just one. Enough to come fully into view. He wore dark boots and gloves, and over his chest a badge, not a police badge, a corporate insignia. It was the same symbol that had been on the dog's tags. The flask. Sarah's stomach turned. He stood there, calm and clinical, as if observing animals at a distance. Then, in a low voice, he spoke. They weren't supposed to survive. Every hair on Sarah's neck rose. "What did you say?" The man tilted his head. The prototypes were scheduled for disposal. The program was terminated. "You mean the dogs?" she snapped. "You tried to kill them?" "They are not dogs," he replied evenly. "They are property." Tommy's hand gripped her arm tightly. "You left them to die in a well," Sarah shouted, stepping forward. "We didn't leave them," he said. "They escaped. Highly unusual behavior, especially from F-Series. We believed both were terminated. Until now. As he took another step closer, the standing dog launched forward, barking violently. Sarah grabbed Tommy and pulled him behind her, the stick raised. "You come one more step and I swear I'll—" The man raised a hand calmly. "I'm not here to cause harm. I'm here to recover assets." "They're not yours," Sarah hissed. "They're living beings." "Experimental units," he corrected. "Designed for enhanced perception and emotional calibration. Your son's connection with them is interesting. We'll want to study that as well." Something inside Sarah snapped. "You won't touch my son." He paused. "Miss Conway," he said quietly, "you have no idea what they are, what they're capable of. The breeding program wasn't shut down because it failed. It was shut down because one of the earlier litters showed deviation, unpredictable emotional behavior, attachment." He looked toward the pups. "The one with the marking he's not supposed to exist." Tommy stepped beside Sarah. "That's why he matters," he said, eyes locked with the man's. The man blinked, surprised at the boy's voice. "Leave," Tommy said. "Now." There was silence. Then a hiss of static. From the man's collar, a voice emerged. "Unit D47, status report." He didn't reply. Just turned his head slightly, never breaking eye contact with Sarah. Then, after a long beat, he spoke not into the radio, but to her. "This never happened." And without another word, he turned and disappeared into the trees. Sarah didn't move until the mist had swallowed him whole. Only then did she collapse to her knees, holding Tommy close, the two dogs pressing in around them protectively. And from within the shelter of their bodies, 4 tiny pups slept peacefully, unaware that their very existence had just been threatened and defended. The light had begun to fade entirely now, dusk giving way to a deeper, more unnerving shade of night. The clearing lay still except for the quiet sounds of breathing Sarah, Tommy, the dogs, and the soft rustling of the newborn pups in their mother's embrace. But Sarah couldn't rest. Her arms trembled, not from exhaustion but from rage, righteous, trembling fury. That man, his voice still echoed in her ears. They weren't supposed to survive. She rose slowly, brushing wet leaves from her jeans. She scanned the tree lane, looking for any sign that he might return. But the trees stood unmoving, silent sentinels. Still, something didn't sit right. "Tommy," she said, her voice low but firm, "stay close to the dogs." He nodded. No fear in his eyes now, just something sharper. Alert. Older than it should have been in a 5-year-old boy. Sarah moved to the far edge of the clearing, retracing the path the man had taken. Her boots squelched in the soft earth, and she paused with every step to listen. After a few minutes, she found what she was looking for. Footprints. Heavy, deep, angled as if someone had been standing in place for a long time. Then more. To the left, smaller indentations. Tire tracks subtle, just at the edge of the trail. Sarah crouched and touched the ground. Still wet. Still fresh. He hadn't come alone. Her heart pounded. She followed the tracks until they reached a patch of compacted mud. That's when she saw it, barely visible in the fading light. A black syringe cap. A small circular dart lying beside it. Tranquilizer grade, no doubt. Her stomach turned. They were prepared to take the dogs by force if needed. Or worse. She stood quickly and turned back toward the clearing, her eyes scanning the tree line again. How long had they been watching? How many had come? And more importantly, were they really gone? She broke into a jog, retracing her steps, panic rising with every stride. When she burst back into the clearing, Tommy was right where she left him, kneeling beside the pups, one hand on the mother's head. But his eyes snapped to her instantly. He knew. "They're close," he said. Sarah knelt beside him. "We have to move. Tonight." Tommy looked down at the puppies. The mother let out a low moan, still recovering. The second dog, her sister, lifted her head and slowly struggled to her feet. "She can walk," Tommy said, nodding toward the stronger dog. "But not far." Sarah's mind raced. They needed shelter. Somewhere isolated. Somewhere they wouldn't be found. The woods near the old river trail, there was a cabin, half collapsed, unused for years, but it was stone and hidden beneath thick overgrowth. It was their only chance. "We'll go now," she said. "What about the babies?" Sarah looked at the tiny pups, their eyes still sealed shut, nuzzling blindly into their mother's belly. Moving them in this state would be dangerous. But staying meant being hunted. She turned to the mother. "Can you walk?" The dog stared back. And then, slowly, painfully, she lifted herself onto trembling legs. Tommy smiled. "She wants to go." Sarah nodded. She grabbed the tarp they had used as a birthing mat and tied its corners into a sling, forming a pouch. Carefully, she placed the pups inside, the mother walking beside them every inch of the way. Tommy held the lead for the second dog, who walked protectively at their flank. They moved quickly into the forest, away from the well, away from the place of birth, following a narrow, barely visible path. Moonlight pierced the canopy in thin white lines. The only sounds were the slosh of mud beneath their boots and the occasional whimper from the pups. Every few yards, Sarah turned back, watching for movement, but the trees stayed still. For now. After nearly half an hour of steady walking, they reached the cabin. Stone walls, collapsed roof in one corner, vines overgrown across the entrance. Sarah pushed open the creaking door. Inside, it smelled of mold and forgotten memories, but it would do. They settled in silence. The dogs curled into a corner where Sarah laid fresh leaves and rags. The mother nestled beside the sling and gently pulled her puppies against her. Tommy curled against her back, one hand resting lightly on the star-marked pup. Sarah stood at the entrance, listening. Wind, distant owl. Nothing else. Until another sound. Soft, almost imperceptible. A beep. She turned. Tommy was holding something in his hand, one of the metal tags. It had started glowing faintly, pulsing with light. Sarah's voice caught. "Where did you get that?" Tommy looked up. It fell off when she stood up. He held it out. It wasn't just an ID tag. On the back was a recessed button, blinking now. A signal. "Oh no," Sarah breathed. "It's a tracker." The tag beeped again, faster now. Outside the cabin, a faint red light pulsed once in the darkness. They had been found. The first red beam sliced through the trees like a whisper of death. Sarah ducked instinctively, pulling Tommy down with her just as a second light scanned across the crumbling wall of the cabin. They had no more time. No more space to run. They had been found. Inside the cabin, the air turned electric with tension. The dogs stood, both growling low and steady. The mother positioned herself over her pups, shielding them with her body. The other dog, stronger now, paced between the door and the small back window like a soldier ready to defend the line. Tommy clung to Sarah's side, his voice steady, too calm for a child. "They're here." "How many?" she whispered. He closed his eyes for a second, breathing deeply. 3, maybe 4. Sarah scanned the cabin. No weapons. No way out except through the front or the broken window. The back path was too narrow, overgrown. The pups couldn't be carried fast enough. Not now. Then footsteps. Slow, deliberate. She stepped into the center of the room and grabbed the only thing she could, a rusted metal pipe from beneath a rotting shelf. Not much. But it would have to do. She looked at Tommy. "Stay behind me, no matter what happens." He didn't argue. Then a voice outside, cold, clinical. "You have something that belongs to us?" It was the same man from the clearing, closer now, confident. Sarah didn't respond. He tried again. "Return the assets, and no one gets hurt." Still, Sarah said nothing. She could hear him stepping on dry leaves just beyond the doorway. Then came the sound she feared most. A cocked rifle. She positioned herself between the door and the dogs. The 2 German shepherds flanked her, low to the ground, their growls rising. "You have 10 seconds." She clenched the pipe tighter. Her mind spun. If he shoots the pups. Suddenly, a noise behind her. A soft, deliberate rustle. Tommy had moved. He was kneeling beside the pups, and in his hands something glowing. It was the second tag, the one still blinking. Only now it was glowing a deeper red. "Tommy, what are you doing?" He didn't answer. He closed his eyes and placed the tag against the chest of the smallest puppy, the one with the star-shaped mark. There was a moment of stillness, then a low hum. The tag blinked 3 times and stopped. No sound, no glow, just silence. Outside, the footsteps paused. Then came shouting. "We've lost the signal." "What?" The tracker went dark. Sarah's breath caught. She turned to Tommy. "How did you?" He opened his eyes, and for the first time, she saw something not quite normal. The puppy stirred beneath his hand, then the mother, then the second dog. They weren't panicked. They were waiting. Tommy stood. "They're not just dogs, Mama. They're waiting for him." "Who?" Tommy looked to the door. As if on cue, a sound exploded through the forest, howling. Not the angry cry of attacked dogs, not the wild shriek of wolves. Something deeper, older. The man outside shouted in alarm. What the hell was that? Then came the growling. But it wasn't from inside the cabin. It came from everywhere. Shadows moved in the trees, dozens of them, silent, fast. Sarah's heart pounded. Tommy. "They came for him," he whispered, pointing to the puppy. Outside, the screams began. The red beams that once lit the trees blinked out one by one. Bodies thudded to the earth, metal clattered, shouts turned to gasps. Then silence. Sarah didn't move. Neither did the dogs. Only Tommy walked forward, opened the cabin door, and stepped into the moonlight. Sarah followed, pipe in hand, expecting horror. Instead, the forest glowed dim, soft, and standing around the edge of the clearing were dozens of dogs. Big and small, some with collars, some with scars, German shepherds, retrievers, mixes, even mutts, all of them unmoving, all of them silent, eyes locked on the cabin. One by one, they turned and walked away. Sarah saw it clearly then. Beneath one of the fallen men lay a metal canister, still hissing faint vapor into the air. The other men were unconscious but alive. And the dogs? Gone. Every last one disappeared into the night, as if summoned and released. She turned to Tommy. He looked at the puppy. He called them, he whispered. Sarah knelt beside him. The star-marked pup blinked its eyes open for the first time. The moon hung high over the forest now, its light silvery and sharp, casting long shadows across the cabin floor. Inside, the quiet was not empty, it was full. Full of breath, full of presence, full of something sacred that none of them could yet name. Sarah sat with her back against the stone wall, Tommy curled beside her, his arm draped protectively over the mother dog and her pups. The air smelled of damp fur, smoke, and pine. But there was no fear anymore, just stillness. The star-marked pup lay at the center of them all, sleeping peacefully, its tiny chest rising and falling with the rhythm of a story not yet told. Sarah couldn't stop watching him. He had opened his eyes, and they had glowed not with light but with awareness. "He's watching," Tommy whispered. Sarah looked down. "Watching what?" "Everything," he said. "Us, the trees, the world, like he's listening for something." Outside, the forest was quiet. The attackers were gone, carried off by the dogs that had come in silence and vanished just as swiftly. Sarah still couldn't understand how it had happened, but she no longer questioned the impossible. Because somehow, in the last 24 hours, everything had changed. She rose slowly and stepped outside. The air was cold, sharp with dew and ash. She walked to the edge of the clearing and looked down the path they had come from. Nothing moved. The earth bore only fading footprints. Except one. Just beyond the threshold of trees, a single paw print larger than any dog's was pressed into the soft soil. Alone. Fresh. She crouched beside it. No sound. No wind. Only a flicker of something in her chest that felt like recognition. From inside the cabin, Tommy spoke again. "He's part of something big, Mama, and we are too now." Sarah walked back inside. The glow from the hearth they had rekindled illuminated the dog's fur in flickers. The puppies slept in a pile, warmth radiating from their bodies. The mother curled around them with peaceful certainty. And the second dog, the one that had once looked so broken, sat by the door, watching, listening. "I think we were meant to find them," Sarah said aloud. Tommy looked up, sleepy-eyed. "We didn't find them," he whispered. "They found us." Sarah sat beside him and closed her eyes. For the first time in months, she felt her shoulders release, her jaw unclench. Her son had returned to her body and voice and heart. And all because 2 dogs chose not to die in a well. Weeks passed. They moved from the cabin, slowly, carefully, always staying in the shadows, following a path Sarah didn't quite understand but trusted nonetheless. She'd stopped trying to explain it. Wherever they went, the dogs came too, sometimes 1 or 2, sometimes a dozen, always watching, always knowing. They were never attacked again. Somehow, word had spread. The corporation vanished from the news. No arrests, no coverage. But one night, Tommy pointed to the sky and said quietly, "They're gone. For now." Months later, on the edge of a quiet town tucked beneath snow-dusted hills, Sarah and Tommy settled into a small house with a red barn out back. No neighbors close by. Just enough space for quiet and healing. The 2 mother dogs stayed with them. The puppies grew fast, especially the one with the star. He was always first awake, last to sleep, always watching. He never barked, never whimpered, just listened. They named him Watcher. And in time, other people began to find their way to the house. A veteran with a limp, bringing a bruised mutt. A little girl who hadn't spoken since the fire, clutching a scarred retriever. A nurse with a black eye and a beagle that had refused to leave her side during her worst nights. They all came, quietly, without fanfare. And Sarah welcomed them. One night, Tommy sat beside Watcher beneath the stars. "Will he always be with us?" he asked. Sarah smiled gently. "He'll be where he needs to be. Even if that's not here?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Then we have to teach others," Tommy whispered, "so they know how to listen." She wrapped her arm around him. "We will. Khalil." On the side of the red barn, someone had painted a single white star. Beneath it, carved into the wood with steady hands, were the words, "For the ones who stayed behind to watch when no one else would." And under it sat a bench. Sometimes, a boy would sit there with his dog. Sometimes, strangers would pass by and pause, drawn to something they didn't understand. Sometimes, Watcher would look up at them, and they would feel, for just a moment, like they weren't alone.